Thank you. Thanks very much, Rachel. It's quite telling that I've been meaning to come to this for weeks, and the first time you've actually got me here is because I'm speaking. So that suggests my diary's been fuller than I'd like. As Rachel said, my colleague Emily was speaking to you a few weeks ago with at the strapline saying Central Scotland Green Network Trust. We are the same organisation, but we've gone through a bit of a reboot and a rebrand recently, so it makes it a little bit easier for us to work with a wider range of partners. So it's really great to be speaking to people about this. And I'd quite like to focus on vacant and derelict land at a time where we have the potential for the system to be changing. I'm long enough in the tooth not to believe that it will necessarily be easy, but there are things happening at a national level which I think gives us some opportunity for at least reframing the discussion, even if we can't shift things as quickly as we'd like. But I thought I'd start off with a little bit of background on vacant and derelict land across Scotland. There are about 11,000 hectares of vacant and derelict land on the Scottish Vacant and Derelict Land Register as of 2019, which is the most recent figures. About 20% of that is urban vacant, which means it is not being used, but there's no reason why it can't be used for the use it's been designated. 80% derelict means there is some reason that the site is not currently usable. That might be about contamination, it may be about all sorts of other things, but the dominant figure is the derelict one. The rate of change is very, very slow. One of my colleagues calculated that we will eventually run out of vacant and derelict land in Scotland, but it will take about 300 years. Last year, the drop was about 1.5%. 28% of people in Scotland live within 500 metres of a vacant derelict land site, and there is very significant evidence to show that that has an impact on people's well-being. Tackling vacant and derelict land is a priority attached to the Central Scotland Green Network, which is our biggest programme of activity, and it's placed there in the National Planning Framework. The reason it's a CSGN delivery priority is that proximity to vacant and derelict land changes dramatically with your level of affluence. 11% of the least deprived decile of people live within 500 metres of a VDL site. It's 55% for the most deprived. So there's a huge thing there about inequalities. There's also massive geographical inequality. So 75% of people in North Lanarkshire live within 500 metres of a vacant and derelict site. There are parts of North Glasgow where everybody does. There are parts of North Glasgow where 2/3 of people live within 100 metres of a VDL site. So it's a massive challenge in terms of its impact on society. We also have this issue around what are now being referred to by the Land Commission and the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force that I sit on as stuck sites. These are sites which are derelict. They are close to where people are living, although some of those dots don't look it. And they have been on the register for at least 20 years. They tend to be quite a lot more complicated, or they're in private ownership and often held away for a whole set of strange land banking reasons. There's a strong concentration in West Central Scotland. They're often in areas where the market won't pick them up because the overall market activity is quite weak, and they're often clustered together, which means there's an opportunity to think about places rather than just focus on individual sites. And the task force is just about to make a series of recommendations to government. They're not published yet, so I can't be very specific about them, with one exception, which I'll come to in a second. But generally speaking, there are a set of recommendations which are about changing the way we think about dereliction and derelict sites. So focusing on the sites that are the hardest, not the whole register. Stopping the flow of new sites. The reason we've only got a 1.5% change in the register isn't because only 1.5% of the sites have been tackled. It's because as sites come off the register, new sites come on. And there's a very strong recommendation looking at place-based focus for regeneration. So finding solutions that are the right solutions for the places that we're looking at, not a set of single generic opportunities across the country. They should have come up as two separate points. There is a push to try and make the information that's on the register actually accessible and usable for a wider range of people. It's currently a set of very complicated spreadsheets, and in some places it's maps in other places. Trying to come up with a single publicly accessible format that allows people to see what is in their area. Some shifts in the tools and the mechanisms. So looking at compulsory sales orders, looking at how land assembly is done, looking at reforming what the public sector does with land disposals and what is viewed as best value. And a series of pushes which are around the finances. So looking at brownfield remediation as an infrastructure investment and a priority there, trying to align the strategic funding streams like the Vacant and Derelict Land Fund, like the Scottish Land Fund, around the place principle. Considering whether there actually might be some links to biodiversity offsetting and biodiversity net gain as a way of looking at funding changes in brownfield sites, and some work on land tax and other aspects of the tax system. So some very broad ranging and quite systemic recommendations being made. And then the 12th one, the one I have put in, is the one that we're interested in most, which is a suggestion that there should be a major national green infrastructure investment programme, and that a significant component of that will be urban green space, that it will be community led, and they'll be looking at low carbon and at renewable energy. So there's a strong green component to these recommendations, which we were delighted to see. Those recommendations throw up a whole set of opportunities that could change the system. There's a chance that we may be able to break the logjam by changing the focus, by changing the system that keeps sites unused, by changing the policy that sits behind that, and actually by allowing more people to come up with ideas and access the data to make those ideas into genuine action. There's a fresh push towards productive use and a much wider definition of what we mean by productive. And there's an aspiration to shift the attitude towards sites becoming unused and trying to find end uses which are there from the day that the first use stops. There are, however, a series of risks attached. I think there's a really strong risk that if the system is opened up, we end up with more and more of the uninteresting, the undesigned or the poorly designed, the bog standard, the carbon non-neutral. So there's an awful risk that actually if things open up, we'll get more of what we don't want, not more of what we do. And I think there's a real risk around unrealistic claims and expectations. Studies that suggest that Glasgow has more available, 15 Hampden Parks available of land, doesn't take into account the fact that many of these sites do genuinely have challenges and constraints. And if we make too many claims and we make those claims without site-by-site knowledge, there's a risk we'll end up with a push that isn't resourced, or actually we'll end up disengaging the experts, the regeneration specialists and the contamination specialists who will look at the suggestions and say, that is frankly unworkable, why should I speak to you? So there's a need to be clearer and more realistic in what we're talking about if we're going to move this forward. So what are we doing at the Green Action Trust? What are we doing around the Central Scotland Green Network priority that we've been tasked with by government? We're trying to be both strategic, looking at the spatial mix, and more tactical and even opportunistic. So if a site comes up, looking at that site as a single entity and looking at it in its place context, rather than speaking about the whole network. We're engaging with key players nationally, regionally and locally at various tiers from policy right through to practice. We're discussing vacant derelict land in a series of key priorities from policy levels. So we're talking about the green recovery, we're talking about climate action, we're talking about inequalities, we're talking about community empowerment, and we're talking about placemaking. And we're looking at it from both ends. So we're looking at where can VDL contribute to the green network priorities, and where can green infrastructure contribute to the ongoing development of VDL for other productive uses. So we're not purely looking at the network. We're using a lot of background work and GIS and other pieces of work to identify the sites which have the greatest potential for delivering the green network. Looking at green space where in areas of deficit, looking at habitat and access connectivity, looking at carbon through woodland creation, but also looking at things like renewable energy and heat. We're looking at adaptation, surface water, cooling, air quality. So we're trying to identify which sites are in the places where the green network use is genuinely the thing we should be pushing hardest on. But we're also developing approaches which can be applied where they're usable, or can be applied as temporary and meanwhile solutions on sites which are not the strategically important ones, but they are still important to the places that they're found in. So we've been doing some work on naturalised sites, trying to work out which sites have already become woodland or other types of habitat. There is a provision to say that they can be taken off the register because they're no longer derelict, they have a use. However, if you're experiencing them as a blight on your community, changing the name and moving them off the register doesn't make them into an asset. So we've been looking at the things we can do to turn these sites into genuine community green space assets. We're looking at pop-up and temporary uses of sites, from everything from educational stuff that Emily was talking about through to, I was discussing earlier this week, or last week, I was saying to Rachel, somebody who's looking at pop-up hydroponics system that would allow growing on any site. We're also considering whether there might be a case for developing a portfolio of meanwhile uses that would allow public and private bodies coming to the end of a use of the site to find a productive use, so they're not generating the next set of VDL, even if those are only put in place until a long-term future use is devised. And we're looking at ways of using green infrastructure to unlock sites for other end uses. Now, whether that's drainage requirements, whether it's access requirements, or whether it's simply about improving the place quality so that other sites within the area become more attractive and more developable. But there's a chance there that we have a key that will help with a lot of other long-term productive uses. And really, my question is, we're doing this with a green network head-on. I view myself as an urbanist. Green networks are not the only thing, but I wonder what the equivalent is if we're talking about this across the wider view of what makes a great city or a great town or a great neighborhood. How should we be preparing ourselves for this potential that VDL will open up, and we'll be able to do things with it that perhaps we have been unable to up until now. And that's me, that's my details. I'll share the presentation with Rachel so people can contact me if they need to. But I'm just going to talk now.